By now you would have guessed we love Alice, not just for her story, but because her story is about the imaginable scope of meaning and the bounds of sense. Lewis Carroll is a pseudonym for Alice's author, who was a professor of philosophy. In the 2 volumes of this grammar, we have told many stories. Sometimes we have set a thinker's work in the context of their life. Other times we have told historical stories about the origins of a particular practice of media or meaning. We have also told some stories about our own intellectual development. This is a habit of ours, in part because we are trained as historians, and history is essentially a narrative method. First, a definition of narrative, using some of the functional terms we have been developing in this grammar. Narrative consists of a sequence of events arising and crossing in time and place, connected by association, involving agency, and experiencing conditionalities, such as anxious making possibilities, encounters with requirements, and retrospective assertion of eventuality. These are just a few of the transpositions we may trace to develop an understanding of narrative as a genre. Narrative is a particular method for attributing coherence to meaning. So now we want to speak to various aspects of narrative as method and to give some examples. Here again is the overall schema for our grammar. Some of what we can discover in meaning is simultaneous. All 5 functions are always present. Different forms of meaning can appear in combination, and this we call multimodality. For the purposes of analysis, we might freeze a meaning in time and place. We give it a name. We find a place for it in one or several connected cells in the diagram. It is a habit of structuralist analysis to fix meaning in time and place, like this for the purposes of analysis, to formalize separate categories so we can put them in their metaphorical boxes. However, we don't want to leave the analysis at that. We want to trace movement, the red arrow in the visuals we have been presenting, and not the labels and cells. Across the form dimension, meanings are always begging to become something else. You've heard us say this many times. Architects plan a building in text and image because this is part of the process of transposing that meaning in space. A speaker about to encounter a difficult conversation rehearses in silent speech what they are about to say in embodied space. A text is drafted that is about to be spoken in a presentation, a large and challenging transposition. The 3-dimensional experience of a space and its objects is transposed into a photograph. In all these examples, we are not so much interested in the form that is the artifact of meaning, but the process of its transposability. Not meanings as objects, but meaning as possibilities, frequently likelihoods, but sometimes improbabilities. And now on the function dimension. Because all functions are always present, we can focus our attention on one of these major aspects of function at a time, asking our 5 questions about meaning. And within each function, we discover incessant movement. When we ask the question, "What's this about?" or reference, a singular instance can become a plural concept. Who or what is doing this? Or agency. Something about the experience of the other can find its way into the empathetic self. What's this about? Or structure. We move between ideal coherences of the conceivable and the material coherences of the experienceable. What is this connected with, or what we call context? This may be a representation, but this might anytime soon become communication, and as such it may be open to interpretation. And finally, what's this for, or what we call interest? We might move between explicit or rhetorical meanings and implicit meanings seemingly baked into the world by reification. These are just a few of the many vectors of transposability that we have traced in this grammar. Transposition is about movement, not mere reapplication. Because while something stays the same, We'd be lost if there were no regularity and predictability in the world. Something always changes in the transposition. What we are proposing is not like the post-structuralist reaction to structuralism, the infinite unpredictabilities of change contrasted with the regularities of structures. Instead, we are interested to trace patterns in the changeability of our meanings in the world. As transpositions are about movement, we can use narrative as a method to tell the story of these movements. We can tell stories that trace lines of movement.
Now I'm going to give some examples of narrative as technique. All you have in front of you when you first see this oil painting in the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne in Australia is this image. It's huge. It's 8 metres across, 3 metres tall, and it has a name which you can read, Big Yam Dreaming. But we need to tell some stories to reach into some of its deeper meanings. But to explain why we even want to tell this story, here is some of our story. We've travelled many long and dusty roads, indescribably beautiful roads, during our research on literacy in the many communities of Indigenous Australia. This is one of those roads, to a place called Utopia. We like this idea, a place in name to which we would like to travel, metaphorically perhaps. But we suspect that the person who gave it this name, a colonial pastoralist, did so in irony because the country needed many square kilometres to support just one head of cattle. In 1976, ownership of the Utopia cattle station was returned to the traditional owners of the land. They had never left this land, sometimes continuing to live their traditional lives on the land, other times working for the pastoralist. Here's the sign for the school at what was previously the main station, painted on the hood of an old car. And this is why we were there, looking at these hybrid, multimodal and multilingual literacy practices in order to engage a new generation of Indigenous teachers in this post-colonial moment as they began to work in their own communities. Here is one of the emerging teachers outside one of the one-room schools that had been created at a number of the outstations. Instead of travelling to a central school, the school would come to the community, the traditional country of an extended family group. And here are 2 more of the emerging teachers at another outstation school. Again, the sign is the hood of an old car. The school is painted inside and out with stunning artwork, telling not just one story, but many stories in a multimodal version of multiliteracies. In our story, this is how we came to the place where the artist of our picture lived, the painting that now hangs in the National Gallery of Victoria. And now we're going to mention a pointed absence from the story. We're not going to mention the artist's actual name, nor show you her photograph. Since we visited Utopia, she's died. In Australian Indigenous communities, it's a tradition not to speak the name or show the likeness of a person who's died. This is a mark of respect, an absence as a pointed presence, a paradoxical way of always remembering them. We're just going to mention her anglicised name, Emily. In reverence for her greatness in contemporary art, in arts circles, her works are now simply called Emily's. This is what the National Gallery of Australia says on its website. Big Yam Dreaming demands to be considered among the great contemporary masterpieces of our time. Yes, this is abstract art in the history of modernism. This work is now up there with Lee Krasner. We can analyse the meaning of this painting by telling its story and Emily's in the story of colonialism and the story of contemporary art where, belatedly, this has been recognised as great art, modernist art, for the purity of its abstraction. We tell the story in the first of our 2 grammar volumes, Making Sense. But for now, in an unstory-like way, I will parse aspects of this work from the point of view of our functions of meaning. Reference. Emily's totem is a yam, a creeper that grows across the desert sands and whose edible seeds the women collect. This is a yam growing across the desert. Agency. Emily is the yam. This is her self-portrait, just as the people are the land and the land is the people. Structure. This is the meaning that travels between the ideal of past and future and the material of present persons in their environment. Context. The desert. The people. A first people interacting with modernity. the unsettling meaning of Indigenous art in modern galleries. Interest, the politics of colonial conquest and the ownership of land, of asserting sovereignty, of reframing traditional meanings as merely art. It takes quite a long narrative to put all these transpositions together, or to trace enough of the transpositions for the painting to begin to make sense. And now for quite a different example of narrative as method, software stories. These are an integral part of the most frequent approach to contemporary software development, agile software development. This is a story from our own software work with the CG Scholar social knowledge platform that we've developed for e-learning and scholarly publishing. One of CG Scholar's apps is a social media feed called Community. This story is one we've been working on in the past few days to make updates editable after they've been posted. Two kinds of story intersect here. One kind of story is a unit of activity that Agile development has called a user story, the smallest implementable feature expressed in terms of the user's interest. These stories run like this. As a user, I need to achieve this particular thing, but I run into this particular barrier where my need is not currently met in the software, but a solution along the following lines would likely satisfy my need. That was the first kind of story in Agile software development. The second kind of story is a design story. It runs like this. Someone in the software team writes up the story, team members and stakeholders comment on the story, contributing their ideas and suggestions, and the story is built out as code and tested. Then it's demonstrated to stakeholders and refined if necessary. Then it's released into production. That's the story structure. And now, the next example, multimodal representations of body in the form of a clinical case. Every encounter with a doctor is a narrative. The patient tells a vernacular story of their ailment. The doctor then tells themselves a medical version of that story, which they might write up for other members of the medical profession in a patient record. Then they might add the story of the treatment and the response to the treatment that the patient demonstrates. This image is from a clinical case analysis undertaken by a medical student. The story begins with the patient. I'm here for my 6-month diabetes follow-up, the patient might start to say. Then the student analyses the data, represents the case multimodally in text, diagram, image, and tabular data, makes a meaningful diagnosis, and recommends a course of action. The student then gets a second opinion from a peer and revises their case analysis. Here are two intersecting stories, the patient-doctor medical story and the learning story from draft to peer review to revision, upon which the student can reflect on this as the kind of the story of their own having learned. And lastly, design itself can be reported as narrative. We can parse the available designs, the forms and function of meaning as resources available for a designer, the provenance of the work that they are about to do in their designing. What are the affordances, the potentials, the openings for meaning? What are the constraints of media, context, and the pressures of conflicting interests? Not that parsing implies there will be mere replication, reproduction, repetition. Quite the contrary. To anticipate designing as action is to imply that change is needed and to expect that change is coming. Parsing should not be statically object-oriented. In the transpositional grammar, it is to anticipate change that may be desirable, that may be necessary, and that will inevitably come. Next, the business of designing involves taking these meaning resources, then recombining them. At least in some ways, the design is always new. What are the processes and what is this part of the story of meaning activity? Emily's image brings together the resources of Indigenous culture and oil painting and self-portrait and post-colonial hope. The user story in Agile development traces user experience as narrative and the narrative of all software development and implementation. The clinical case speaks to medical conditions as narratives and the narrative of clinical reasoning in a collaborative learning environment that models in, if you like, the professional medical communication. In every case, a design analysis can, by means of narrative, trace multiple layers of transposition, of multimodal transpositions across forms of meaning and the transpositions in meaning functions. And now we can parse again because we have traces of meaning that have been left in the world. As a consequence, the world has been redesigned. We have Emily's painting, the software that has been developed, the person whose body has been healed, and the medical student who has learned from documenting their case. Now we can pass the new designs not for the fixity of the artifacts they have become, but for their trajectories and their possibilities, what they could have been and what they may yet become. The new meanings not yet made, but begging to be made in some new story. The meaning is in the making, and the making across a series of transposition. This, if you like, is the meta-narrative of meaning.